Woman, weep not. Welcome to another manly rant where we encourage males to crush effeminacy and maliteracy, some people say, and to aspire to domestic excellence. And we're looking at this rant today about grief and trauma and how Jesus conquers grief, trauma, and death. We're looking at this from St. Luke chapter 7 today, and we're grateful for your attention. Jesus conquers grief, he conquers death and trauma. And we listen because trauma, grief is unavoidable for us as humans. Now, many fear death, many fear trauma, and give death and trauma power because of the strength and the impact of the loss and the grief, the pain associated with it. This is a central feature of the gospel because Jesus says that we must take up the cross. And the cross speaks to grief, it speaks to trauma, suffering for a good cause, for the cause of saving the mass, the many, based on our own internal, personal suffering. Now in Luke 7, a woman had lost her only son, and Jesus, in the midst of the suffering, says, "Woman, weep not." Many think of this as a very impersonal, a very impractical thing, to not weep. But what was Jesus really saying? Similarly, a reggae icon, Bob Marley, wrote a song about this maternal grief. And centuries later, after Jesus, as many women in Jamaica grieved the premature, many would say, loss of their sons and their children due to gang violence in the ghettos of Jamaica during a very bloody political time in Jamaica in the 70s and 80s, late 70s and the early 80s. Now in this reference, in Luke 7 verse 13, Jesus breaks the popular understanding. So was Jesus being insensitive? No. The word sounds insensitive, but it is not reflecting what Jesus did in Luke 7. In Luke 7, Jesus breaks the popular understanding of the rabbinical, these are the Hebrew teachers of the law, and the Levitical, these are the priests of the law. Their rules were to not touch death. You can see Leviticus 21, 1 to 3, and Leviticus 21, 11, Numbers 19, 14, and Ezekiel 44, 25. So instead of Jesus withdrawing himself from death, suffering, and grief, Jesus touches our grief and he causes resurrection. In Luke 7, Jesus touches this young man who was dead, breaking the laws, the religious laws to not touch a dead body or a corpse. Of course, there were rules against necromancy or religious practices where you touch dead bodies and do rituals to try to bring them back to life. Many people see that as necromancy. And Jesus was seen as a necromancer because he touched dead bodies and brought them back to life, which is what he did in Luke 7. Now, in Luke 7:13, clearly, in my understanding, Jesus is not saying that we must not grieve. That is not sensitive. And again, later we see in Jesus' own experience with Lazarus, when his friend Lazarus died, one of the most powerful verses in the Bible, and I believe it's one of the shortest ones. It says, Jesus wept. So does Jesus grieve? Yes. So he's not saying that we must not grieve. But while we experience trauma, while we experience pain, we must, as strong men, and we can be more aware of Jesus' power to defeat grief than the emotions of the grief and the trauma or the pain itself. We don't want to minimize the trauma, but we also don't want to worship the pain and the trauma that we experience. We're not called to worship pain and trauma, despite how gigantic and Goliath that trauma feels in the moment we experience it. True worship is where we can see Jesus beyond the pain and the trauma. I believe in John 3, Jesus says, just as the serpent was lifted up by Moses in the desert, and that speaks to, I believe, Numbers 21, where snakes were biting people and they were under trauma, they were under attack from their own doing because of disobedience against Yah. But Jesus tells Moses to to make a bronze serpent and lift it up. And the people that would pay attention to the bronze serpent, that was later called Nehushtan, they would be healed of the bites of the snake. So Jesus is again saying that look beyond. He's not saying to ignore the pain and the trauma, but there is a bigger person beyond the pain and the trauma. He in fact takes on the form of that pain, because the snake on the cross, that bronze serpent, was in the image of the snake. Does Jesus become a snake? No, but he is a representative of our pain or grief on the cross. He experiences the grief and the pain of all humanity, from from Adam to the last baby to ever be born. He experiences not just our sin, but our pain or grief, as Isaiah 53 says, on that cross. So he is the summation of all human grief. That is Jesus on the cross. So he's not telling us not to grieve, but he's saying, I am joining you as the Son of Yah in the grief to transform it to life. Now Paul says, so we're saying here there's someone greater than grief, there's someone greater than pain, who is able to transform that pain into life again. It sounds like mumbo jumbo, but in the spiritual reality, this is what Jesus does. He crushes our pain on the cross and turns that to life. So Jesus is not saying to grieve, but not to grieve, but he's saying that your grieving is a comma. His resurrection is a full stop. So Paul says to grieve not as those who have no hope. 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 13. John concludes in Revelation 7 verse 17 that Jesus the Messiah leads his flock to rivers of living waters and wipes away all, A-L-L, tears. That is, he completely heals trauma. So we're speaking to men who have been traumatized by a father, by a prison system, by a mom who was unfairly mean to him. We're speaking to women who are going through similar trauma and raising young men in an effeminate manner in some instances. All of this grief and all of this trauma that has this domino effect, the gospel as the power to heal it through Jesus Christ, giving us the Holy Spirit, who is our comforter. Now, grief and tears are a temporary reality that are crushed and conquered by faith in Jesus. So we are speaking to us as men that are, yes, Jesus is talking in this context to a woman to weep not. And are we as men to have a comforting role to the woman in our lives? Yes. However, we will not be able to do this with our own pain and trauma unaddressed. Many of us need counseling. Many of us need various therapy to assist us. But on top of that, the spiritual reality that we want to walk in is that we are not victims. We are victors because of Jesus. The pain has the effect of transforming men into weaklings often that are assuming a weak and a victimized posture. And we can recognize the power of the cross to make us victors again. So we want to comfort women, but before we can do that, we have to be men that are comforted ourselves. We're grateful that you have come to the end of this manly rant about trauma. We want to support our women, but we as men have to handle our trauma well through the power of Jesus Christ. We encourage you to leave your comments in the comment section on YouTube. Now, why rob God and this world of you and your family? And until next time, be nuclear.